from the JLE in London, you're listening to History for the Curious, the podcast. 20 minutes with Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch, hosted by myself, Menat Reisner. Join us as we cross continents, sail through the centuries, tracing lives, uncovering events, and following epic journeys to reveal the untold stories and the mysteries that have impacted our history and shaped us into who we are today. And the Jews in Britain at the time weren't rallying outside Downing Street, begging him.
I don't know how much this was known outside. It
was published in the Times, you mentioned.
About Auschwitz.
Yes.
But the idea of bombing Auschwitz was a much more select group. It came from Holber Weissmandl via Switzerland. And remember, the Americans refused to do anything, to the degree that the only way anything was accomplished in America was by publishing it in the press, because Roosevelt just basically, and the State Department, didn't care about Jewish life at all. Now, in fact, in his book, Sir Martin Gilbert writes that Churchill had been reluctant to meet Weitzman during the war, and in conversation with Christopher Soames, Churchill said that he had been reluctant because he found Weitzman so fascinating that he would spend too much of his time talking to him. And he was told, well, Weitzman gives a very different reason, actually, which Churchill asked, well, what is that reason? He said, the reason you wouldn't see him was because for you, he was conscience, and Churchill was silent, which is, of course, very revealing. All in all, though, Winston Churchill was a remarkable leader whose support for the Jews is almost as inexplicable as his implausible rise to power in May 1940. I mean, Jewish history is marked by unlikely events, and it's difficult to view Churchill's strong support for the Jews as anything else. He was a political friend at a time where this was a real rarity in the UK. Also, having mentioned him, I will do so again, as Rabbi Liss said to me, Churchill refused to consider peace with the Germans in 1940 when many in the British government were in favour. The Jews in England would probably not have survived this quote-unquote peace treaty with the Nazis, so that's something to factor in. Yet, at the same time, Churchill was motivated by a position of policy, which came first, which I guess is unsurprising.
And did he have any involvement in immigration of the Jews from Europe? Jews having a hard time to get into the UK?
Yes, you mean on a personal level? Generally speaking, but he was in opposition during the 30s. He was only brought in May 1940 when there was a war cabinet put together. So he was not in a position of authority during that entire decade, basically.
Okay, so I guess it's up to people to draw their own conclusions, but you've certainly drawn a picture. We still have some minutes left. Do we have any other prime ministers for tonight?
Yes. First of all, the two prime ministers on either side of World War II are important. One oversaw the time when Jews were desperate to leave Germany because of Hitler, and the other was post-45, where Jews were desperate to leave Germany because of the war and the DP camps. And both groups wanted to get into British Palestine. So the question is, how did these two prime ministers fare? We'll start with the second. Clement Attlee led the government from mid-45 and through the years leading to the establishment of the State of Israel. It was under his premiership that his foreign secretary, Bevan, came out fighting strongly against the Haganah. He deported or interned any Jews trying to smuggle themselves into Palestine. He arrested leaders of the Jewish Agency, and he returned Jewish concentration camp survivors to Germany after the war, this is, nevertheless. And Atlee not only condoned, but actively supported all these moves. And if we move into 1949, he's still PM. Britain's Labour government still refuses to recognise the existence of the State of Israel. Atlee and Bevan had basically been humiliated by a group of Jews who'd been determined to force Britain out of Palestine, and they couldn't shake off that bitterness towards Israel. And, of course, the British government didn't want to offend the Arab countries around Israel. Oil was never far from their minds. But what is not known, and almost inexplicable, is that Atlee looked after a child refugee, a family that escaped from the Nazis in the months leading up to the Second World War. He was then the leader of the opposition, and he sponsored a Jewish mother and her two children to leave Germany in 1939 and move to the UK. And Atlee invited one of the children into his home in Stanmore in northwest London. And it's not hearsay. Paul Willer was the child refugee. He's now in his 90s. He stayed with the Atlees for 4 months. His mother was a midwife, but rules prohibited midwives from keeping their own children in hospital accommodation. And so she needed somebody to take her child in for a short period of time. And this Mr. Willer told the press, they took me inside what was a very large house. They had a maid and a cook, and they used to take cold baths every day. And at breakfast, we would gather around the table, and Mr. Atlee played this game where he held out a coin and asked whose monarch's head was on it. Whoever gave the correct answer was allowed to keep the coin. And on the 80th anniversary of the Kindertransport program, Mr. Willer met Atlee's granddaughter. So, go figure. At unknown, it's bizarre.